Okay, nice welcome to today's webinar, which is about conceptual frameworks versus theoretical frameworks. I can see we have a lot of newcomers to our webinars. So first of all, welcome to the Doctoral Tab, which is the mentoring community that provides relevant advice to doctoral students on what to do next, and ideally on how to do it quickly and efficiently. And our webinar cover topics that are put forward by the Doctoral Tab community. So if you are having particular needs or interests, then be very much welcome to let us know. As just said, our webinars are recorded. They are made afterwards available for replay. And in addition to that, they're also meant to be interactive. It means you can ask questions at any point in time. Having said that, if you're shy and don't want your voice to be recorded and be made available to everyone, you might ask questions also through the forums, or you wait until the end of the webinar where we will go literally speaking off the record and then have still an open discussion round where you can ask any questions that you might have. With this, let's move into what we will be covering today. So generally, we hope that at the end of the webinar, you will understand the main difference between a conceptual and a theoretical framework, that you recognize the key steps in developing a conceptual framework, and that you learn through the panel discussion about the conceptualization, application, and examples of conceptual and or theoretical frameworks. With this, let me introduce the three panelists that we have. First of all, we have Professor Dr. Valerie Lindsay, then we have Professor Dr. Bostjan Gomiscek, and we have Dr. Dermot Kennedy. Might I hand over to the three of you, one after the other, to quickly say a word about yourself?
Okay, I'll start since I was introduced first there. Thank you, Dr. Andreas. So I'm Valerie Lindsay. I hail from New Zealand. I'm currently living and working in the UAE. My area of interest in terms of research and teaching is in international business and strategic management. I've supervised around a dozen PhD students and a small number of DBA students as well over my time as an academic, and learned a lot from them as well as from my own research, which I'd be keen to share with you this evening.
Thank you, Valerie. Bostjan, please. You're muted.
I'm muted, yeah, I used to be. Hi, everybody. Majority knows me probably anyway. I've been actually here quite many times trying to support you, but generally my area is quality management. From now, let's say, perspective of PhD students, I have completed quite many PhDs and DBAs. I was actually in charge at 2 universities for a doctoral program. So through our hands, as well as Professor Valerie's hands, actually went quite many different students with different issues. And I would say all of them finished finally in a good mood. So I hope that we'll be able to support you as well.
All right. And third.
Very good. Hi, everybody. I'm Dermot Kennedy, and I've literally just finished a DBA at the University of Liverpool. So I had my Viva just in February, and did minor edits, and I've graduated now. So I'm finally finished. So it's very fresh. But I'm in the business world. I work as a senior director at Adobe. It's a software multinational. I've been there, was literally there 20 years this February. This Friday. And I look after it, our web business. So it's a big business, so my research was in a practical business problem that we have at Adobe. And so yeah, that's what I can offer is very recent experience of trying to understand theoretical and conceptual frameworks.
Do you? That's good. You will help us.
Thank you. I'm particularly pleased to have Dermot here today, because Dermot is actually one of my former students who I had the pleasure to supervise. And we know each other now for probably 6+ years. And I still recall it very, very like it would have been yesterday. Once I had Dermot the first time, it was in a course And he said at the end of the course, Andreas has unrealistically high expectations of what his students are supposed to do. And well, 2 years later, he asked me to be his supervisor. So I was pleased about that. It sounded like a compliment. So with this, let me hand over. Bostjan, please, you will set the scene here with some introductory questions, right?
Yeah, sure. Let us start then, actually. I hope everybody's ready. And once again, please just come in with your questions, okay? It should be an interactive session, so ask a question at any point of time or write something in a chat, and then we will actually come back and answer all the questions. The idea is really to open a discussion and hopefully even during the session help you to understand or maybe even actually create a first part of your probably conceptual framework, I would say, in this case, not a theoretical. So just come in, please, with any questions you might have at any point of time. Yep, the questions, what we would like to discuss today is kind of, first of all, to understand whether there is any difference between the conceptual as well as the theoretical framework. Many are thinking they're the same. Are they? Aren't they? So I hope we'll be able to clear on that. Then a little bit deeper. So for you, really the questions which you should maybe now, ask yourself a few times while we are talking. What type of framework are you planning to use in your thesis? And especially, can you justify it? Why would you like to do that? Why is that actually the proper framework, the adequate one? Think about that and let us discuss that. Maybe at the end, if not in between. How do you plan to develop your conceptual framework is another question. Do you have an idea? Where would you like to start? How would you like to put, let's say, parts and pieces together in order to call it at the end? That is my conceptual framework. And from here on, I want actually to start, with my hypothesis, my methodology and things like that. And in the end, for some of you, especially the ones who might be working with quantitative methodology, or how would you test? What do you need? What would you like actually to do? Maybe we can go into the direction which methodology would be actually appropriate to test your conceptual framework. So those three questions, I will be trying actually to answer the first one, but the next three ones are really kind of for you to think a little bit and then actually try to solve this issue, because you have to solve it. At one point, you have just to say, done, it's clear, and then I can actually continue with my research. Before you clear it all at this stage, please do not rush into any other steps. Andreas?
Yes.
That you will do that.
Okay.
Next one.
So.
Yeah, but see, that's the issue now. I don't know if I can clear it all now. Okay, I'll try to clear it. Yep. So as we said, just a short introduction, not too long, because we would like to have a lot of time to discuss and hear actually Dermot with his experiences. So what I did here is actually I presented two, and that's why I said simple definitions, because maybe some of you will not totally agree with me, but I would say can even justify and actually defend my views on that. For me, let us start with a conceptual framework. For me, a conceptual framework is really a framework where you are presenting your relationships. So you can draw something like that and then say, okay, my independent variables and my dependent variable. If you want to complicate, sure, you can actually do some moderation. You can actually complicate a little bit more. You do actually some mediation and stuff like that. It's really up to you. But that's the idea behind it, that you are putting actually together a framework which has been built upon definitely some theoretical views, definitely different literature review sources, maybe even your observations. Sometimes you will even do first qualitative, let's say, part where you will be talking to people, and based on your results of the qualitative part, you will go then far forward, let's say, and you will start building up your framework to be finally, for example, tested. and as I said, maybe your assumptions. So that's how I see it. But as I said, we do have a little bit a different view, many of us, so maybe somebody else will come with another idea. But that's for me. That means a conceptual framework is how you see the relationships you would like to develop, test, justify, whatever it is. And on the other side, for me, a theoretical framework is really developed on existing theory or theories and, let's say, theoretical frameworks. So how I see that. And if you go then further, we'll talk that later on, you might always add, let's say, your views in order to broaden maybe the scope of research. And another view I wanted to present here, you can see it actually quite often as well, where some authors are saying that is your conceptual framework. That means something like we have discussed right now is your conceptual framework. And this framework will be kind of, a set of 3 different frameworks. One will be, because you have to justify it yours anyway, so will be linked to a theoretical framework where you can bring actually your, as I said before, theoretical frameworks, maybe theories, or any other strong theoretical underpinning. Then you will develop, based on your conceptual framework, methodological framework. So what way of, let's say, methodologies, tools, strategies, and so on you will be using. And finally, some of them are saying that based on your conceptual framework, you will be developing your analytical framework as well, because you have to kind of analyze your data, present the data, test your, let's say, conceptual framework. So that's another view. But once again, probably the most important part from my perspective for all of us, whenever we start our PhDs or do any other research, is to set actually and be clear, what are we really trying to do? What are, as I mentioned here, our relationships? What are our constructs? What are our dimensions? What is actually finally our outcome, output, or whatever it is on the dependent variable side. So that's how I see it, but I would say that probably Prof. Valerie will come with some ideas and correct my views. Okay, now or later on, Valerie, you're always actually welcome. The next one, please. Okay, that's actually not important right now, the title. What I would like now, just really shortly, to show you how I see different, let's say, this difference between the theoretical one and the conceptual one. That's how I see it. So I'll bring 2 slides just in order maybe to help you understand my views. So for example, you have definitely heard, maybe of you, theory of reasoned action, which was kind of developed by Fishbein and Eisen in 1980. And it talks kind of about attitudes or behavioral intention, and finally how we do behave. As I said, that are on the input side, and then we have actually the final your behavior. And many times in our studies we kind of finish, let's say, with behavioral intention, because we can probably not measure then the real behavior, but doesn't matter. What I want to say is actually that would be, for example, a theoretical framework for your research. Then a little bit later, 5 years later, Eisen has actually suggested an update, should I say, or further development of the theory of reasoned action, and he published a theory of planned behavior, the next stage. As you see, he has used the first part, that's this one, which is theory of reasoned action. He added one additional construct, and based on that, he said it is actually a better view to describe the intention. It is a better way to describe the behaviors in case we are adding the perceived behavior control. After they have tested that, we have then actually, let's say, admitted or accepted that that is now a theory, which has been actually mentioned and used actually many times. And that's kind of the same idea. You can take something like that. That would be, let's say, your theoretical underpinning or lens or something like that. And if you use it as it is in your context, it is actually then your research. But why we do not like to have that? Because usually we say we should develop something new, not just using the same theory. It would be nice that you are adding, let's say, or using this theory and developing your own framework, but, you know, having in mind, for example, this theory. The next one, please. And that is just another case. What I wanted to show you is, for example, how another study, that was a paper actually published last year, where the authors used the theory of plant behavior, as you see it here, as well as they added a marketing ethics theory and built their, let's say, framework. So they put two different theories together, added some, let's say, different views a little bit, and tried to predict, let's say, digital privacy intentions. For example, that's another view. And that is how I see that we are really strongly relying on theoretical, let's say, underpinning. So we, or they have put in a way two theories together in order to start actually, in predicting. The relationships are a little bit different. They are changing that a little bit, but still they have used two different. One is actually theory of plant behavior, and then the marketing ethics theory. So I see that they are rather using really clear theoretical, let's say, basis for their research. Next one, please. And then here we are coming now to the two slides with examples of conceptual frameworks where we do not see kind of really a clear link to theory. I mean, a simple one would be just that we are saying we are trying to implement something, and what might implement the, let's say, what might influence the implementation. And it could be that, let's say, finally you agree on these factors, but if you see it from a different perspective, you might actually kind of, let's say, replace those with some other ones. But definitely, once again, let us not understand it in a way that whenever you are building your conceptual framework, that you are kind of forgetting about theories. Because the idea behind it is that we always, should I say, justify, let's say, our relationships from the theoretical point of view. You cannot just come and say, that is it. I see it that way. No, you theoretically should actually implement some justifications from theoretical point of view, or as we have mentioned before, maybe you can actually use your own observations or results from the, let's say, qualitative phase in order to build a framework which will be afterwards tested. And here I will not even go into that, just two of my PhDs where they built actually kind of their frameworks, which were finally then tested using the let's say different statistical tests. And for example, for this one, the resource-based theory was kind of the main theory which was supporting actually their view, but they did, I mean, you cannot see it from a kind of, let's say, directly, but that was kind of the basis or the theoretical underpinning. And maybe the next one, and then I will not bother you anymore. Let us clear that first. And that's another view how we have developed two frameworks. For example, for this one, the input was qualitative study where we were kind of trying to understand different motives, internal, external motives, and then actually what were the dimensions. And that is actually how our framework was kind of built. We tested it afterwards. And as you see, that's why I brought that. The next stage then was, we said, okay, that is everything okay, but we would like to go a little bit deeper. And based on this framework, with these dimensions, we actually then developed another one. And then we tested another framework, conceptual framework, on, let's say, another dependent variable. So what we are trying to say is you should I hope, I mean, that's how I see it, have your ideas, your views, and bring actually new, should I say, aspects, new constructs, new dimensions, actually additional to the ones that have already existed, or you, based on the literature, actually get ideas and build, let's say, your final framework, which will be then at the end, let's say, tested in case we are using quantitative methodology. Or you start on the other side and you say, oh, we do not know a lot. And through the qualitative, let's say, methodology, you will be building a framework. That does not mean that we have to test every framework. No, many times, as I said here, directly, we could even stay as simple as that with just a conceptual framework without testing it. But we went actually a stage forward. So even that's a good result in many, many cases, that you build actually your own framework based on the qualitative methodology, because that would kind of explain and make us understand new perspectives in our research. And I guess that's it from my side. So the next slide will be then just the introduction.
Yes, but we do have a question from Randolph. Randolph, please.
Hello, thanks a lot. For my PhD, I'm planning to investigate pedagogical discourse in primary classrooms, and my plan is till now to use two frameworks. One used by Basil Bernstein and another one used by Robin Alexander, and try to sort of integrate them together and see where it takes me. So would that change it to a conceptual framework from a theoretical framework to a conceptual framework? Because I'm guessing I will end up with something a little bit new.
I mean, as I said, let us have a discussion on that. But from my perspective, whenever you're putting actually two theories together, or two theoretical frameworks, or whatever it is, actually you are building your own one, but definitely you would have to highlight what is now the benefit of it, what is the contribution actually of it, why you are putting those two things kind of together. And definitely these two will be building your conceptual framework, because based on that, you will be developing everything else. That means you will be probably developing your hypothesis, you will be developing your methodology, you will be taking actually based on that the adequate, as I mentioned before, statistical tools and things like that. So yeah, it is your conceptual framework, but I would say strongly relying on the theoretical frameworks. I don't know, I would say let us hear Prof. Valerie as well, how she's answering this question.
Thank you, Bostjan, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I think I agree with what Professor Bostjan has just mentioned. I mean, if you are trying to put together your own perspective, your own conceptual logic around a problem, and you happen to be doing that by integrating or using together two theoretical frameworks, it's a conceptual framework in my view. It might then evolve into something more theoretically based in terms of theoretical framework, but when you're putting together either existing theories or other concepts together in ways that haven't been done before, it's your interpretation of how these relationships might be existing. So yes, a conceptual framework. I might just add something. I've got a couple of points here in my notes about cautions. And we might, Prof. Bostjan or Dr. Dermot might come into this as well. When we're looking at using theory, it's a standard, we're using a theoretical framework. there's many aspects to consider, but this one I think is very important. It's very important not to just what I would say cherry pick. I'm not sure if that's a widely understood term, but we must not just choose which variables from the theory we want to incorporate into our conceptual model. A theory is a theory. It's a set of relationships that have been measured, established. The relationships as well as the variables are just critically important in the theory. So be careful not to just take out a component of theory. For example, to take out the perceived behavior control from the new theory of planned behavior. It doesn't work. It's no longer a theory of planned behavior. So you're creating something different or new. So always be aware that if one is using a theoretical framework in the sense that you're actually utilizing that framework in your own research, that you use it in its true and intended way. And now you can always add things, as Prof. Bostjan mentioned. One of the real contributions that can be made to existing theory conceptually is to build additional theory, is to build new ideas, what we might call theory informing a very important role of conceptual thinking. So certainly we can add to existing theory, but it's not generally a good idea. There may be exceptions, and my colleagues might be able to expand on this, but as a general rule, use the theory as it exists, as it's intended, and not just pull it apart and take what suits you, which is very tempting to do in some cases.
But as we mentioned, I mean, you have that, let us highlight that once again, or stress on that once again, you have to bring actually the contribution. It is not just using your theory in another context. I mean, yeah, maybe, but you have to justify why that is a contribution for a PhD.
We might have,
I guess, another thing which is extremely important to understand it in a proper way.
Yeah.
You know, it is always, PhD is always a contribution. So it's not enough that you just say, okay, I'm taking actually this theory, and that will be actually a good theoretical foundation for my PhD. That's not enough.
Yeah, no, a contextual contribution might, might be something, but in a PhD that's not sufficient. You need to be adding something conceptually beneficial to the existing theory.
We have a second question in the chat. In what situation are you allowed to have the theoretical framework? I find many scholars having a conceptual framework. Any answer to this?
Yeah, I was trying actually to explain that, and Prof. we just answered that in a way as well. So you can use your theoretical framework. I mean, from the perspective we are seeing it, okay? That means that you are taking an existing theory and plug it into your research in order to find, let's say, doesn't matter why, I mean, you have, as I said, justify why your results are now a contribution. In a PhD, I mean, it's a different way. If you are doing, let's say, a research study in your organization, and you would like to understand how the things are running, that definitely would be very useful, because you are taking an established theory, you plug it in, and actually you see how actually the things are running in your organization. But that is actually many times not enough. In case you bring some additional stuff, I don't know what it is, can be actually, I don't know, a special multicultural context, or can be, I don't know what, but you have to stress that and justify that will be finally the contribution. And I will not go back now to the research gaps and stuff like that, but in your research gaps, you might actually show that hasn't been done yet. And that's why you are trying actually to use this existing theory, which is a good thing actually to show. Because theory is a theory. I mean, the relationships are established, so here's no doubt, let's say, and you just use it in order to explain different things which are running there. But for a PhD, please be cautious. Many times that's not enough. And on the other side, yeah, we can say, as I said, there was a slide number, I don't know what, where I presented. Some of the authors always see that what you are doing is actually in a way your conceptual framework. And then you are having three, should I say, sub-frameworks. One of them is the theoretical framework, how you are actually justifying what you are doing. I would say in most of the cases, that's how I see it. I would even say that usually we are pushing our students to develop their own conceptual framework, because on that, it is kind of easier to show, justify, explain their contribution than taking an existing theory. I don't know, Valerie, how you see that?
Yeah, I just absolutely just sort of build on that a little bit. In a theoretical framework in its purest form, if you like, fundamentally, which is somewhat different from a looser conceptual framework that perhaps hasn't, lacks theoretical explanation, is that a theoretical framework is going to be explanatory or predictive, sometimes descriptive, but the two key areas are explanatory or predictive. Now, that can be in a particular context, in a particular setting, which is going to be important. And in that process of explanation, it's very likely that there will be additional items, variables, additional concepts that come forward as you're testing it. So the contribution there will be applying a theoretical framework in an unusual setting, or one that hasn't been done before, in either an explanatory or predictive way, and being able to add something to that helps to explain the contribution that theory is bringing. In some disciplines, simply confirming a theoretical framework is sufficient, perhaps as a publication in a lot of sciences, for example. But in the social sciences, we're looking for much more depth, if you like, in terms of, because context differs so much, and situations differ. So yeah, that's all I would want to add there, really.
There's another question.
Have we answered the question or not? Satisfactory to satisfaction or not? I have no idea. Okay, so Yo is coming. You mean Yo's question? If we apply theory to collect new data to prove it in the new case scenario, it's enough for a PhD contribution. I mean, I don't want to how should I say, kill your enthusiasm. But in case you were my student, I would say it's not enough. I'm sorry for that. That's how I see it.
I would agree.
Unless, I mean, as I said, new context. It depends what just new context. I usually say driving, I don't know, a Toyota or a Fiat or a Mercedes, the same route. It's actually for me the same thing. But you have to justify why you are doing it. In case you have the real good justification why you are doing that, then yeah, it's okay, perfectly fine.
We have a hand raised. Colette, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
sure.
Okay, my question is, how do we choose theories to have it as a foundation to develop a conceptual framework? For instance, for someone like me who is currently conducting a systematic literature review, where I've finished conducting it, I've developed propositions, and from the propositions, I've been able to develop a conceptual framework. But my supervisors are saying that I need to base this conceptual, I need to choose a theory to base my conceptual framework on that theory. For instance, the systems theory, or the theory of resources, RBV, resource-based view theory.
Resource-based view.
Yeah. So my question is, how do I choose a particular theory? Because as you said earlier, it is inappropriate to cherry pick. How do I not cherry pick a theory, but choose a theory that will specifically match what I've developed or what I'm hoping to conduct? I'm not sure how to go about it.
Could I have a go at this one first? Sure. Because I think it's a very, very important question. I think actually, Prof. Bostjan, I think you would probably say read, but you've obviously done the systematic literature review quite thoroughly. As you go through your literature review, and as you start to see the gaps emerging, the areas that are of interest to research, the theoretical basis, the underpinning theoretical perspective, maybe several will become very evident, but you will tend to focus more and more on one or maybe two that would be of relevance. So I think that a number of ways of dealing with this. One is, what have others used in your systematic literature review? Is one of those theoretical foundations being utilized, very much, and has it provided newer insights? So always try to look for something that is slightly novel, that is obviously going to be appropriate. Whatever you choose, it comes back again to being able to justify. There's not always one best theoretical basis to use. It depends on what you are wanting to show in your research and in your study. What is it your study is trying to actually highlight here? And that again will tend to point to a theoretical foundation that makes more sense. As I mentioned, when I was referring to cherry picking, it was not about the theories. You need to come to a decision about the most appropriate theoretical background or basis on which to build your conceptual thinking. It was more about what I was referring to there was the variables, as we see in the screen, just these are
constructs.
Yeah, the constructs, the variables. You cannot just take one of those out randomly because it doesn't suit you. You know, you have to use the theory in place. So you cannot cherry pick amongst the variables or constructs to include. But a theoretical base, it will become, I think it's your decision. You can, most importantly of all, you need to justify that and probably justify it from the literature itself. So go back and see what's emerging there most strongly. And just one other thing that it was actually in a publication, one of my very early publications, was made aware of by a rather stern reviewer. Now, when you are looking at using a theoretical foundation, make sure that everything you do in your study is consistent with that particular theoretical perspective. There are sometimes competing theoretical perspectives. For example, in my field, we have internationalization theory, traditional, which is companies go very slowly into new markets, versus a born global theory, which is they go very rapidly. So I could choose either of those theoretical perspectives for my study, but then I would have to be consistent in the way I continue to conceptualize from that and interpreted my results, etc. To that particular theoretical base. So just make sure you're avoiding particularly contradictory theoretical perspectives, particularly if you wanted to combine them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
If I can add something, you know, all of you hate me because what Prof. Valerie just said, read. I mean, yeah, but that really helps you because whenever you're reading actually a good journal paper, you will see that there is a theoretical background. And based on that, and based actually on the relationships you would like to kind of study, you will actually get a proper probably justification for that. And that is why I usually anyway request from my students that the first chapter of the literature review is theories, theoretical background. And that sets kind of the framework actually of, yeah, let's say theoretical framework of your PhD or DBA. But if I recall right now, I mean, you know, I can, that with cherry picking a little bit, and that was the Joe's question in a way as well. I recall we had the DBA student. She was working in an area of supply chains, and she presented, or she included 3 different theories in there. And I was supervising her as well as a co-supervisor, and I did agree actually with those 3 different, let's say, theories, because they were definitely contributing to her conceptual framework, because she was building something, or she built something new. But one of the examiners came and said, he didn't use the word cherry picking, but not far away. And he said, take one, focus on one. You cannot just actually bring so many theories in there and say that you are actually using all of them. So try to focus and try to show why this theory is really the fundamental, let's say, for your research. But yeah, I mean, I see it in a similar way that you, first of all, yeah, read, I agree with that. And based on that, you will get probably the idea and see which of the theories is really the most supporting one. But maybe we can ask Dermot now, that he comes with his let's say struggle and fights and so on. that how he was building his conceptual framework. Maybe that will help us as well to understand how it goes.
Let's move into that. We still do have 2 questions in the chat,
Okay.
which
Sure.
will stay for later.
Okay.
They are not forgotten.
Andreas, do you want me to share, or do you want to share
Yes,
the file?
I want you to share. There you go.
Just let me see if, just confirm if you can see everything okay. And
No, it's coming up now. Now it's there.
Okay, I'll just get it onto full screen. Okay, so I just want to kind of give you a sense of the research that I wanted to conduct. Basically, Adobe is a big software multinational. We do business in 230 countries. We create a lot of marketing content at headquarters in California, and we want, we think that if you translate it and do a bit of tweaking, you'll have it ready for all of the markets that we do business in. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that very, very often. And so we're facing a problem that we're simply failing to localize, to get the content to be culturally and linguistically appropriate. And so here, I just want to give you a very, very quick example, and then I'll lead into where the frameworks fit in. Here's a marketing campaign. It's called Take It, Make It. Take a good photograph and then make it brilliant with our software. So the right-hand side of the picture shows the picture kind of cleaned up or clarified with our software. So from a cultural perspective, this ran into problems immediately. We just thought you translate it and you put in the local pricing or bring it up dynamically from a database, and it's all be fine. But immediately ran into difficulties with some regions where they didn't think it was appropriate to have a female with bare arms and bare legs on the image. We ran into linguistic problems because, well, take it, make it, it's meant to mean take a good photograph and make it great with our software. But when you translate it, the words take it and make it don't mean that. They don't take it doesn't necessarily imply in French or Korean that you're taking a photograph. And if you try to turn it into the words that mean take a great photograph and make it brilliant with our software, it becomes really long and clunky. And so it's time and time again, we have these kind of problems where the regions receive this content and don't know what to do with it, really. They can't use it in the way that it was originally intended. And so I started digging into what I thought at the start was cultural and linguistic issues. And so this is a little bit to do with when do you come up with your framework? Because we start with the task, as was mentioned earlier, about your first draft literature review, and you start searching for relevant theories. And I came up with one called Johnson et al. 2006 framework on cross-cultural competence. It was about how you could train everybody to be more aware of all the cultures around the world and to work better in those cultures. I came up with a Singh et al. Diagnostic framework for web localization, which is focused on a lot of linguistic issues. But I mean, they just didn't really fit. I'd had other researchers who were finding those kinds of frameworks and finding the perfect one and coming up with, research like, interview questions based on those theories to explore further with research participants. But it wasn't working for me. It didn't capture the full business problem, and it definitely didn't capture this sense of a tug of war between the regions and headquarters over this content. On one side they wanted it consistent brand, they wanted it cost efficient at headquarters. On the other side they wanted it localized, totally tailored to the needs of the market. And we're caught in the middle, building the US content, localizing it, and trying to satisfy the regions and not succeeding. And that tug of war. So even though in theory, like I'd hoped that I'd have a theoretical framework established at the very start and work from there, what actually happened was I realized we had all these different stakeholder groups. We were in the middle between people at headquarters and people in the regions. And I adopted an inductive approach. I basically said, look, we don't actually understand what's going on here. And so instead of a whole set of prescribed kind of questions that I'd ask at the interviews, I conducted 24 interviews where we literally I just presented the problem, examples of it, and asked them what they thought was going on. And what was really interesting about the result was it didn't work the way I was expecting. Now, it felt like the cultural issues and the linguistic issues were actually the context of the problem, but not the actual problem. And the actual problem then had much more to do with governance. You know, in other words, who's deciding what and where are they and where are the resources based? And so suddenly I'm then almost like going back to the theory again and looking at theoretical concepts like constructs like globalization and localization and localization and centralization and decentralization. And the big breakthrough moment for me was discovering a theoretical framework by Hollandson called the globalization framework, because this framework captured the issues, the context, the linguistic and cultural issues, but it captured that tug of war between the one size fits all, the kind of global headquarters saying we want it to be, like low complexity, low cost, consistent branding, so on. And then on the regions, they wanted it tailored to their every need. And so we're in the middle trying to find that balance and harmony between the two, this concept called localization, halfway between global and local. And so this became my theoretical framework for my research. And not only that, not only in the sense of a structure on which to base my research or kind of set boundaries on my research, like a scaffolding for the research, it also proved to be an incredibly useful analytical tool for my data analysis. Like when you research, you meet up with 24 people and each interview is over an hour, you have a ton of data. So I was able to basically go through the data and search what I originally thought were like would have been looking for cultural and linguistic issues. Then I started looking for differing perspectives, and then it actually became conflicting perspectives. And so essentially I ended up with two camps, the people that had the global perspective and the people that had the local perspective, and searching for anyone that had a sense of both sides, and that could, that there would be global dynamics, that there would be an opportunity for meeting in the middle and trying to find ways forward between the two perspectives and mitigation ideas. And so I went through all the data searching for that. And basically it did find local dynamics, but they worked in the areas of cultural and linguistic issues. There were lots of conflicting perspectives in those areas, but the global dynamics were in the areas of governance, and they were very practical issues to do with interconnectedness and to do with organizational structure. And so I then was diving into those topics to find ways forward. So then like when I applied the localization framework to Adobe, I ended up with this, which is essentially the different perspectives on both sides and the areas where there was potential for finding a way forward right now. And then because I was conducting action research, we were actually making change happen completely changing the way headquarters worked with the regions, turning from, essentially what was a very much a hub and spoke model to a blend of the hub and spoke and multi-hub, so that the regions had much more say in decisions, and it's having an enormously positive impact. And I would suggest maybe opening up local dynamics in other areas as a result of that success. And so that's my last slide. But I wanted to kind of give a sense of what it felt like for me. I thought that I was going to find the perfect theoretical framework on day one, in my first literature review searches. In reality, what I used as my theoretical framework in the final thesis, it came out of the research, it definitely wasn't visible at the start. And I don't know if that's that unusual. I don't think so. I think that, and in some respects, it's what made it exciting for me. It was a big leap of faith, to trust that I could go with the inductive approach and just present the problems and hope that they'd say something that would provide me with data that I could actually, find some pattern in or find some relevant framework that would help me interpret it. it did work. Like the process did work, and was very rewarding as a result. And yeah, I mean that's I've a doctorate at the end of it, and I also went from director to senior director as a result of it. And so there's benefits on different scores. So I'll stop there and just, but it's maybe giving a sense of what the frameworks were like for me going through the doctoral journey.
Thank
you, Andrew.
Can I get the screen back?
Oh, sorry, stop sharing. Okay, there we are. Yep.
Thank you. Before we come into the discussion, let me just find the slides. Where are they? There we are. Am I sharing the correct part of the display? The big or the small?
Small.
Oh.
Right. And now? Can you see the big one?
No, you'll have to flip screens.
I still have the small one.
Is it working?
Nope.
No, we're still seeing the next slide as well.
But anyway, see,
it's big enough to read on my side anyway.
Before you manage that, let us go to the questions.
Yes, and I want to come to the questions. Let me put them on. Okay, I just wanted to quickly summarize the main outcomes of what Dermot just reported. That he said the framework didn't fit fully to the problems that he was experiencing, which I think is a valuable thing to recall. So if it doesn't fit to the problem that you're looking at, then what is fitting to it? And that the selection of the framework, as we will now come into this discussion, was not a linear thing. The fitting framework Dermot actually identified halfway through the research after already conducting interviews and gathering data. And that while identified at a later point in time, if you read the thesis, it looks like it would have been right there from the beginning. So again, it's also not linear in the way it is written up. It's presented in a nicely journey way that makes a good story. And so it was like a bottleneck once Dermot identified a fitting framework that made just the research flowing through like charm. And with this, we have some discussion questions where we will look on both ends, Dermot's experiences and Professor Valerie and Professor Bostjan's input from working with a vast array of doctoral students and research projects. So the first one is a no-brainer. When in your doctoral journey did you develop the theoretical and conceptual framework? We just learned from Dermot the initial framework wasn't fitting, and the actual framework that was fitting was discovered later in the journey only. Valerie, Bostjan, is this something you would say is typical or atypical, and how should students go about that?
Valerie?
Okay, yes, it takes some time, but the most important thing that I think we both perhaps have found with the students we've co-supervised, Dr. Bostjan, is that it's actually fairly important, but with quantitative data in particular, it's fairly important to have a pretty good idea of the conceptual and or theoretical frameworks that are going to be underpinning the research before you start collecting the data. Now, we've had situations where the students have got an idea, oh yes, I want to do this, I'll go out, collect data, and then they actually discover that the theoretical framework isn't necessarily going to be okay. It's much, much easier to deal with that in a qualitative setting, but if you've only got one go at collecting your quantitative data set, make sure you've got some pretty good idea of where you're heading with it. And it's not, it's not unusual to go from one set of thinking to another, but that's all happens before the data collection. It should all happen before the data collection. In qualitative, I just qualify that in qualitative research, it's particularly common that the data that you're collecting will lead the researcher in different places, so you can't anticipate that, and that's okay. I mean, we can deal with that in a qualitative sense. That's not so much of a problem.
I mean, actually, in most of the cases we worked, the framework was built as an outcome of the qualitative methodology.
Yeah.
In a way, and the question was, are we going farther and try to test that or not?
Yeah.
So that is kind of one of the important results anyway, that you are developing a new framework, because based on that, you are explaining kind of, probably new areas or something like that. It depends what is your topic. But yeah, I mean, once again, definitely, I mean, we've said that so many times. Data collection is really the last thing, and don't rush at any point, because on your conceptual framework, or if you want to theoretical framework, your methodology is actually developed. So you cannot even think about data collection before you know what methods are you going to use, because different methods are really requesting a defined data set, and you cannot do that unless you really know actually all about your research. Data collection is really the very last part, especially in the definitely quantitative part, but even in the qualitative, you have to develop your, should I say, propositions first before you go and actually start preparing your interview questions or your protocol and things like that. So you have to have clearly defined framework. Should I say framework, or should I say conceptual framework, in order to start thinking about all the other things? Because propositions are the outcome, hypotheses are the outcome, methodology is the outcome. All that stuff is actually coming afterwards. So I'm sorry, once again, reading, and based on that, developing your actually views, understanding, and putting the things together to a point where you say, that's exactly what is actually of interest for me. I'll go with that. And after getting the approval from the supervisor's side.
All right.
I know we are not answering nice. We are not giving actually nice guidelines, I would say, for the majority of the students. But it is like that. It is, and it is actually should be fun. We have another question.
Yeah, there are. But let's move into the questions further, because let's collect them now, and then after in the discussion we can go through the questions. Dermot, how did you plan to develop your conceptual framework, and how did it ultimately work out?
So, I mean, as I described a little bit earlier, I thought it was all going to be about cultural and linguistic issues, and so my initial plan was to identified frameworks in that domain, but because they weren't a perfect fit, I adopted an inductive approach to the data gathering, and through analyzing that data, I found the theoretical framework that actually enabled me to interpret it and to understand the business problem the research problem that I was trying to I suppose get to the bottom of and find a way forward. So I mean, for me, it was very much the breakthrough was in the middle of the project. It wasn't at the start. At the start, I mean, I came up with frameworks at the start, but they weren't the ones. And I know other researchers who have, and I understand the point about quantitative, but in my research, it literally became clear through the analysis of the data, and that's when it suddenly became clear to me. So I'm not sure if I answered the question adequately, but it's not linear, as you said. By the way, I wanted to make one other quick point about the point earlier about not cherry picking or messing around with theories. It's worth pointing out that one of my external examiner was the professor who was responsible for the theoretical framework that I was basing my research on. So, clearly, if I'd been doing the wrong things with that framework or messing with it too much, that wouldn't have gone down well at all. So, you can be in that situation as well, where you've got to, you got to respect the research that's gone into these frameworks and understand like the context and the you know, not twist them or cherry pick, as was mentioned.
Thank you. We have a question, Julian, please. You raised your hand. Do you have a question?
I do. Yes. Can you hear me right?
Yes.
Okay. So my issue was almost an opposite of what Dermot Kennedy said. My thesis focus was on Hazara genocide, and because I also belong to the ethnic Hazara minority, but I have never been to Afghanistan, so I would be part of the diaspora that grew outside of Afghanistan. But when Bostjan, for example, mentioned that conceptual framework refers to, you know, your present assumed relationships, and then at the end you also talk about your assumptions. So because I belong to the same ethnic background, the same ethnic, and the language is the same, the culture is the same, my conceptual framework started off with, well, of course, we have shared issues and feelings. And that's where the problem started, because once I went into the interviews, some of the interviews turned out to not feel the same that I would, or the expectations of those questions were, some of them were off. And I think maybe that's where the learning curve happens, when you start learning, wow, I mean, it's not a blanket statement. It should not be a blanket statement. The assumptions should not be the same. So the theoretical framework that I had created around the assumed assumptions had to be changed, because the whole thing has to change now. So I just wanted to, I don't know if this is almost an opposite of the Dermot thing, because now I had to re-educate and relearn my own ethnic linguistic background. Yeah, but that's just, maybe I think Bostjan wants to say something regarding that.
Yeah. Getting, I don't know, getting a little bit curious. See, you said rework or redo or something like that, your conceptual framework. I don't know if I understood you correct. You have already done your interviews. So that is then your result, because what we have often, I mean, many times done is that you have your conceptual framework, you established it in order to plan, should I say, and execute your research. But the results are giving something else. So that does not mean that you have to re-establish or rework your conceptual framework, because you have built it based on assumptions, literature review, frameworks, whatever it is. But your results are showing something else. And that is actually your result, your contribution. And the question is, which framework is now theoretically the, should I say, proper one, or which one could theoretically at one point, I don't want to go so far, but become a theory or something like that. So the next stage would be probably to test it based on a quantitative study, big sample or something like that, and to see whether that was just actually the outcome of your, I don't know, I didn't get how many interviews you have performed, or is that really actually so? So I don't know, you know, don't say that you will go now back and rework your conceptual framework after you have collected the data. No, that is your result. And you have definitely done something or shown something new. And that is actually the contribution. So that's how I see it. I don't know, Valerie.
Sure. I do not want to say I'm going to redo the conceptual framework, but I'm saying that I have to rethink the theoretical framework, because the conceptual framework gave me an assumed theoretical framework that I would be using, but the conceptual framework turns out to be, some of the assumptions turn out to be wrong. And so now the theoretical framework, if I go down the same line, it will give me limited data based on the information that I needed. So I did 11 interviews, some in Paris and some in Copenhagen, Denmark. But now, based on the assumptions were incorrect, the conceptual framework was partially incorrect. So the theoretical...
Don't say that. I mean, I don't see it that way. No, seriously, no, don't say that. In case you have used, just a second, let us discuss that. In case you have used proper theoretic theories, if you want to, I don't know what you have used, or theoretical frameworks, and actually good journals in order to justify and show your conceptual framework, which was, doesn't matter, supported by the theory. Why would you redo it? That was at that point actually the knowledge, should we say, and now you have built something new. And that is your contribution. That's how I see it. Unless you were a little bit, should I say, slack or something like that while you are building your conceptual framework, that's something else. But if you have done it in a proper way at that time, and still somebody else probably without knowing your results might build something really similar. I mean, that's how I see it. Valerie, please correct me if I was wrong right now.
Yeah, no, not at all. I absolutely agree, and I think in a way what you've got here, Yulan, is actually your contribution. It's not a turning point backwards. So as long as, again, highlight, as long as you have good, sound conceptual justification for your original model framework, sorry, your original conceptual framework, that is solid. The fact that you have found something different and expose the fact that the theoretical underpinnings may not in fact be relevant is something that you can have a really good time discussing in your interpretation of your findings, and that is your contribution.
So you are not going back. You are not going back. No. Okay, you are not going back and doing your theoretical framework. Yeah. Please do not do, because what is then your contribution? Yeah. In a way, and hopefully you will even not find something which should support probably your whatever. But if you do, then that is actually for your discussion to justify your new relationships.
And one thing that you can actually do, colleagues and I have just done this with a paper published a couple of years ago. It's not at all uncommon, particularly with a qualitatively based study. You start off with a conceptual framework, which should be strong. That's really important, that your original conceptual framework is well supported with the literature, and the theoretical framework that you're using at that time makes sense. In light of your findings, it's perfectly okay to revise your conceptual framework and present it as a revised conceptual framework in the light of your findings. So it's an end point. It's at the end of your thesis. It's part of your contribution, that the conceptual framework has the data have supported a refinement or a building on the original conceptual framework, and at the same time exposing an alternative or additional theoretical perspective. Now that is fine. It's a really good thing to be doing that. But don't go back to the beginning with it. Don't take that and go back to the beginning. Yeah.
Don't try to, because then yeah, definitely not. Don't go back.
So it sounds like you've actually
that
got
was
a nice
done
study.
in a proper way.
Yeah.
Be happy that you found actually differences.
Yeah,
now you can write cool. a nice discussion, a perfect contribution, and 2 papers. Perfectly fine. We're happy with that.
You have no idea how good that makes me feel. I'm so relieved to hear that. It is sort of the same in line with the supervisor's information as well, but also telling me to strengthen. It gives you a lot in your positionality. So you were assuming to know this, and then this is how it changed. So it brings you to your conclusion and a big discussion of how you came to that different thing. So thank you so much for taking your time to answer my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just link that back, because in parts this is very close to Dermot's case, and as Valerie said, the start and end point need to be very well defined. In Dermot's case, the end point could have been, this is not a linguistic issue, this is not a cultural issue, it's a localization issue, and there's a this could have stopped. However, that would not have answered the problems that Dermot was facing. Therefore, he had to go further. He didn't want that to be the end point because it didn't solve the problem, right? If just it would have been the knowledge, what is going on here? It's a localization issue. Topic closed, right? But it wasn't the end point. So you need to design your research problem. And there's also a question, 2 questions actually, or 3 questions that are related to that, Dermot. So hasn't your work just turned into grounded theory because you explored something and then came up with your framework, or wasn't it at the end deductive work? Because you said it was inductive. And I recall we discussed that in great detail.
Yeah, and this concept called abductive, which is used by some people to describe somewhere halfway between the two, where it's kind of are a mix of both. I mean, if I started the research again now, knowing that globalization is at the core of the issue, I would be, doing research deductively with, very specific questions on that area. But when I was starting the data gathering with all of these interview participants, I was keeping it very open-ended because I didn't know what the full scope of the problem was, and I consider that completely inductive. I mean, to a certain extent, is everything deductive in that sense? If you're using preconceived, frameworks of, that you learned as a baby and a toddler, I don't know where you draw the line between the two. It's a little bit grey in my mind. Maybe it's abductive, but I didn't actually discuss that in my thesis. I saw it as inductive and drawing conclusions at that point. Now, if I was to do more research right now, with the knowledge that I gained through this doctoral journey, I most likely do deductive research on it, to further investigate that problem, because I've honed in on the core area, and I would be able to ask very specific questions in interviews in that area. I mean, I don't know if that rings true or correct for others. Grounded theory, sorry, just to say something about that. I mean, I wasn't building new theory. I was using an existing theory and applying it in a completely different context and coming up with, additions. But it's well, maybe I'm not correct, but I always thought of grounded as more. And I know a few friends that have done grounded theory doctorates, and they approach it quite differently. So I don't consider it grounded theory research personally, but I'm dying to hear other comments.
Thank you, Dermot. Let me ask, how is it in general working, Professor Valerie, Professor Bostjan? Is research either inductive or deductive, or can research have those elements? And is it that you could say, well, there is an element of grounded theory because yes, it was exploratory to some degree. How do you deal with that?
Interesting question. And the originators of grounded theory, Glaser and Strauss, which probably many of you have read, actually fell out later on after they published and worked together on exactly this issue. I'm not quite sure which, I think it was Strauss that went off on to be a little bit more liberal in his interpretation of grounded theory. The premise is that it's actually impossible to do purely grounded theory because we always come into any kind of exploration with some preconceived ideas. It's just human nature, we cannot avoid it. Now, Miles and Huberman in their well-known qualitative books state that emphatically. So from that point of view, that's a pure extreme grounded theory, fully inductive. The data, and this is probably the one time when it's, it's really important not to have a prior theoretical framework or conceptual framework, because we're supposed to let the data speak to that. Purely deductive, on the other hand, yeah, I guess that again is very much an extreme. But in order to be able to do purely deductive research, we have to make sure that we can measure everything, and we don't have to develop new scales and measurement instruments and things. In
case we take an established theory and then just try to, I don't know, let's say, show it as a methodological contribution, theoretically could be done,
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, I think in reality, it's something in the kind of work that Dermot has done, I think, is very much in between the abductive, as you say. But when we're saying we're doing deductive research and inductive, I guess the most important thing is we actually know what, we're clear about what we mean by that, and we follow the appropriate methodological approaches and analytical techniques, and that we are able to measure what it is we're purporting to measure, and not kind of make up things.
We have two questions from Leon Wei. Must the DBA thesis present a conceptual framework? That's the first question. Anyone wants to answer on that?
I would, from my perspective, I expect from my students that they always do have a framework, because as I said, framework guides you. I mean, you should be so reading, research gaps or business case. Then you have your gaps, as I said, or gaps or a business case, research question, framework, and then you start with your propositions, hypothesis, or whatsoever methodology. That's the way how it goes. So I cannot really understand how you can do your research without a framework. That's my issue. It has been since ever, and I've seen even for the, let's say, lower levels, kind of master students and even bachelor students, for their thesis, they were actually always more successful whenever they understood what they are doing. And understanding what they are doing was really nicely presented by a framework or through a framework. So I would say, yes, I prefer to have a framework, but maybe another supervisor will see it in a different way. Even as examiner, I want to have a framework because it tells me so much.
Okay. Being aware of the time, I think we need to come into the off-record 5 to 10 minutes discussion times that we still promised. With this, let me just say, if you do need further training, we do offer training workshops on exactly this matter. So if you are needing help, you're allowed to reach out to us. And with this, we will go off the record and stop the recording to call still in questions that you might have. Let me stop the recording.